The Pink Puppy Dog by Mark Reinsberg, originally published in Imaginative Tales, May 1957. Narrated by Tom Trussel. That was a hard luck day for the Delfield family on K840. In the early relative morning, while everyone slept, a shard struck their asteroid. Awakened from a sleep as vacant as the space surrounding the hermetic shack, Delfield felt the tiny fragment of a planet shudder in its orbit between Mars and Jupiter. He saw the position of the stars shift in the transparent dome overhead. Then he heard Susie wailing in the next compartment. He jumped up and ran to the child, but Jean was already there, comforting Susie in her arms. She was a pretty 2-year-old with brown ringlets and a skin so fair that veins were visible on her forehead. Tears welled from her yellow-grey eyes. "It threw her out of bed," said Jean, with something of the child's fright in her own eyes. "What happened?" "Could have been a rock ramming into us. I don't know. Could even be a spaceship. I'll have to go see." He embraced Jean and held her close with Susie in between. "It's all right, Susie. It's all right. It's all right." "It's all right," said Jean. "Mummy and Daddy protect you." Delfield heard the throb of the air compressor, muted between the shack's thick gravity floor. "Did that just go on?" he asked his wife. He was frowning and listening through Susie's wails. "I didn't notice." She bounced the little girl playfully, but her aside was sober. Delfield strode to the thermostat. There was a slight drop in air pressure. "Anything?" said Jean. "It's down to 13. "That could be normal leakage, couldn't it?" "Yes," said Delfield, "but we'd better check. We absorbed quite a jarring." A prospector's shack is small, a hemisphere less than 30 feet in diameter, with a large triangular room in the center and 3 tiny compartments along the sides. But the surface area of the outer shell is enormous when you go searching for leaks. Delfield ran his eyes along the shelved, toy-cluttered wall of Susie's room. Then he inspected his own room, and finally the kitchen-bathroom compartment. No obvious signs of a crack. "I'll make a thorough check from the outside," he said, putting on his clothes. Susie had stopped crying, and Jean had laid her down in the double bed. "This is one risk you didn't tell me about," Jean said while tickling Susie. The little girl was giggling delightedly. "More tickle," she said each time Jean stopped. "Collision in space is mathematically almost impossible," said Delfield. "But it happened to us," Jean said dryly. He knew what was going on in her mind. She had knowingly assumed all the apparent hazards of an asteroid prospector's wife. Bad synthetic food, unhealthy close quarters, isolation from people. There was space sickness, too, and gravity disease, and always the possibility of a jammed airlock or failure of some other nearly perfect machine on which their lives depended. Now this new peril. "You needn't worry, dear. It's 1,000,000,000,000 to 1 it won't happen again." He grinned, and she smiled wryly. "Say, you don't think that was the man you were expecting, making a crash landing?" "The Mars Metals representative?" Delfield laughed. "Well, if so, we won't get the contract." Jean laughed too, but it really wasn't very funny. They were both tensely awaiting his arrival. The ore samples they'd sent had aroused interest. That was definite. Mars Metals officials don't travel 100 million miles from Ceres just to pay a social call. Delfield got into his space boots, and Jean helped him put on the rest of the suit. "Just when is this man supposed to arrive?" Jean asked as they adjusted the helmet. Relative time had so little meaning from planet to planet, and Jean had never been able to understand the new absolute time that astronomers had worked out for interplanetary use. Neither had Delfield too well. "Figure he'll be here around supper time." Jean winced. "Oh, Dave, how can I make a decent meal with synthetics?" She was a short, pert brunette with Susie's fair skins, and a naiad-like waist, and expressive round eyes of sapphire grey. "Honey, this isn't like back on Earth when you bring home the boss for supper. These reps aren't impressed by home cooking on an asteroid. They want rich ore, not rich food." Delfield walked clumsily in his spacesuit towards the airlock. Then it happened as always. Susie popped out of bed and grabbed hold of his leg and started crying. "Don't go, Daddy! Don't go in airlock!" She wailed so forlornly and pathetically that it usually broke Delfield's heart, but now he was impatient. "It's all right," said Jean. "Daddy will be right back." "Don't go!" cried Susie. Jean tried to detach her by force, unsuccessfully. Delfield himself was afraid to move, for fear his clumsy boots might come down on the child's bare feet. "Scoot, Susie," he ordered. "Go play in your room." Delfield was irritated. "What makes her so damn insecure?" he demanded of Jean. He'd gone out in his suit at least 200 times since they set up 3 months ago on K840. Somehow Susie couldn't get used to the idea. "Susie, how would you like to close the doors?" Jean suggested. Resourceful of her. Delfield picked up the motif. "Yes, Susie, help Mummy push the buttons." On a panel in the central triangular room were 3 toggle switches Susie loved to play with. They opened and shut the sliding doors of each room. Actually, they were space-proof emergency hatches rather than simple doorways, sealing off the 3 outside compartments in case of a punctured hull. "Push buttons," agreed Susie. Jean carried her to the panel, and the child stretched out her hand eagerly to flick the switches. With a muffled rumble, the bulkheads slid shut. Susie was pleased. "Now," said Jean, "open the kitchen door for Daddy." The airlock was a bulbous extension of the kitchen compartment. "Say," said his wife, "the compressor has stopped." Delfield nodded in his helmet. "Yes, I noticed." "Then there's no air leak. You don't have to go outside?" "It could be a slow leak, one that wouldn't start the compressor going until our thermostat was down to 13 pounds per square inch. We'd never find the hole from the inside, but out in space I'd see air escaping like steam." Delfield fastened his helmet and stepped into the lock. Always when he did, he thought of the expense. It cost $1 worth of air each round trip he made. Trivial amount to the successful miner, but he wasn't in that class. Jean came in over the helmet radio. "Darling, the compressor's started again." "Yes, it should. That's the air we lost in the lock." He walked gingerly on the surface of asteroid K840. There was no atmosphere, of course, and there was no perceptible gravity either. His magnetic boots clung to the jagged, mile-thick rock with a grip the manufacturers guaranteed would never fail. But how many tales had he heard of asteroiders taking one vigorous, uncautious step into eternal space? He thought of his suffocated, space-suited corpse floating in that infinite tank, and his steps slowed to a guarded shuffle. "See anything?" Jean asked. "Not yet." He climbed the domed roof of their shack where he could see the full hemisphere surface. There were no telltale jets of steam. "Looks all right," he said at last. "Good. Come on in, then, and have breakfast." "A little later, dear. I want to go over and see what hit us." "Can't that wait?" "Costs money to go in and out," he reminded her. He and Jean had left Earth with enough reserve for at least a year. So they thought. But finding an asteroid was far more difficult than the many glowing magazine articles had suggested. All the big ones like Ceres and Pallas and Juno had been staked out for over a generation, with meagre returns. Then James Gorton found erbium and thulium on Lutetia, and the great rare earths rush of 57 was on. By the time Delfield had given up his metallurgy job and reached the belt, all the small asteroids of the mile-diameter class had also been gobbled up. After a month's futile search, Delfield solved the problem by buying up another man's unworked claim. That left them with money enough for 6 months, half of which was now gone. "Pink puppy dog," said Susie. One of her stuffed toys, he recalled. "What about Pink Puppy Dog, sweetheart?" Delfield asked. Susie babbled happily and incoherently into the radio phone. "Listen, Jean, I think it must have hit on the other side. I'm going to work my way over there." "Dave," Jean protested, "don't go without breakfast all morning just to save a little money." "Please," said Delfield irritably. "This is important." He strapped the portable jet onto his suit. It was a nozzle attached to a carboy of nitrogen gas. Delfield squirted it in the opposite direction from which he wanted to go, sailing low above the rocky surface at a cautious 20 miles an hour. Abruptly he was on the daylight side of K840, illuminated by the pale diminished sun, little brighter at this distance than the terrestrial full moon. "Dave, don't you think if this man's coming for supper, I ought to prepare something fancy?" "Well, sure, why not?" "I think I'll radio Thetis for some frozen food, have them make a special delivery." Delfield tried hard to control his annoyance. "Look, honey, that's awfully expensive, and I don't think it's necessary." "But Mars metals is so important to us. You want to make a good impression on this man. It's certainly worth the investment." "No, Jean, I don't want you to do that." Delfield scanned K840 in the dim light. In shape it was rather like a mashed cigar butt, with raw, uneroded crags jutting at all angles, and signs of terrible stress where the asteroid had splintered away from some large parent body. There was in fact no ground smooth enough and large enough on the daylight side to provide foundation for their hermetic hut. But it was on the daylight side that Delfield had discovered the praseodymium-ytterbium deposits, and it was there that he carried out his small-scale refining operations each day. And it was there, as if aimed at the spot, that a massive shard had landed. It was a boulder that on Earth might weigh 1,000 tons. On K840 it weighed nothing, but its mass and inertia had squashed Delfield Refinery to the shape of a lettuce leaf. He let out an anguished wail. Delfield worked most of the day without food or water, without returning to the shack. He strove frantically to clear away the rocky debris. He blasted and shoved and dug and hauled. "Please, darling, please let it go," his wife pleaded. "Got to get it done before the man from Mars gets here. We don't stand a chance if he sees it like this."
"Oh, Dave, this isn't our kind of life. Why do you struggle so?"
Her voice became despairing as the hours passed. Delfield's answers grew shorter. He was sweaty, breathless, exhausted. "We can make a fortune at this. Go back to Earth in a year. Take it easy rest of our life."
"That compressor has been going steadily all day," Jean said. "Won't you come back and take a look at it?"
Nothing could tear Delfield away from his task. "Must have been the shock. Jarred the mechanism. Don't worry, Jean. I'll fix it."
"Dave," his wife said finally, "it's almost supper time. If you expect this man at all, you'd better come home. Right now."
When Delfield returned, he was desperately tired. For the first time in 3 months, he allowed himself the luxury of a full hot bath. It was while he was in the tub, and while Jean was busy preparing the dinner, and while Susie was sitting on the floor with a dozen of her toys scattered about, that the man from Mars Metals arrived. Delfield swooshed out of the bathroom, leaving a trail of wet footprints into the bedroom. Urgently, Jean swept the toys into Susie's room. When the visitor came through the airlock, there was superficial order in the shack. "Malcolm is my name, representing Mars Metals." He was a tall, burly man with a bullet-shaped head and close-cropped hair. His cheeks were fleshy, and his complexion a salmon pink characteristic of Mars settlers. He carried a bulky grey leather briefcase, which he set on the floor alongside a toy Jean saw she had missed by the sofa.
"Yes, we've been expecting you. My husband will be right out. Won't you sit down?"
Susie came out of her room.
"Pink puppy dog, Mummy! Pink puppy dog!"
She gave the visitor a shy, puzzled look.
"Yes, darling, he's in your room," said Jean, smoothing her apron. "Mr. Malcolm, our daughter, Susie."
Malcolm nodded cursorily, but said nothing. Jean could see he was not the avuncular type. She went back to her dinner preparations, which had been thrown off schedule by the guests' early arrival. The dinner itself was a failure. Malcolm did not eat synthetics, which was about all Jean had to offer, and Susie was unusually restive in her high chair, spilling and spattering everything that was put before her. It made a painful impression. Delfield had a sinking feeling, and was glad Malcolm avoided business talk at the table. "I suppose," said Delfield afterwards, "that you want to take a look at the deposit." There was no use postponing the inevitable. "Not necessary," said the man from Mars Metals. "Your samples and survey tell us all we need to know." Husband and wife exchanged electric glances. Delfield remained prudently silent about the collision. "Then you think the load is commercial?" "No doubt about it," said Malcolm. "We know this type of asteroid. Your samples are much like the K370 group, which has proved very satisfactory." Jean bathed Susie while the men talked. A warmth of optimism chased away the strain and weariness of 3 months. She sang nursery songs as Susie splashed in the tub. She dried the little girl and put on a bright red 2-piece pyjama. Then she carried Susie through the living room. "Say good night to Daddy and Mr. Malcolm." "Good night," said Susie, sleepily waving an arm. Jean carried the child into her room and dropped her into bed with a kiss. Then she sat down contentedly on the sofa beside Malcolm. "There are 2 problems," Malcolm was saying. "First is the matter of subsidy. You'll need considerable financing." "I don't understand," said Delfield. "I can produce the stuff without financial assistance. At least, I've been doing it up till now." Yes, but not in commercial quantities. It wouldn't pay us to route a ship this way for the amount you could produce by yourself. You'll need a full-scale refinery here, plus 10 or 12 hired hands." "I didn't realize," Delfield began, when Susie reappeared in her doorway. She looked at her father hopefully. "Come here, dear," Delfield said, and Susie trotted over beside him. He kissed her on the cheek and patted her back. "Now go to bed, sweetheart." Susie stood doubtfully. Jean got up and took her by the hand and led her back to the bedroom. "All right, dear," she whispered. "Pop into bed." Susie started to whimper. "No bed, Mummy. No, pop into bed." "Oh, you must, darling." "Pink puppy dog," Susie whined. "You want Pink Puppy Dog in bed with you?" Jean said. "All right." She turned on the bedroom light and glanced at the toy-strewn floor. That particular stuffed animal was nowhere in sight. "I'm sorry, honey, I can't find Pink Puppy Dog, but here's Teddy Bear." She laid the brown animal beside Susie and turned off the light. "Good night, dear." "Very well," continued Malcolm. "Let's assume, then, that 150,000 would cover the initial payroll period. You can have that at 5.5%, and Mars Metals will rent you the machinery for depreciation value plus 10%. He withdrew a figure chart from his briefcase. "For a Type D refinery, which is the largest you could use, that would amount to 45,000 a year." "Do you actually believe," Delfield said, unable to conceal his awe, "that K840 can yield 750,000 in the first year?" Malcolm stared expressionlessly. "That's a conservative estimate. An aggressive man can probably exceed that figure by as much as 1/3, which of course brings us to our second consideration, your—" "Daddy!" It was Susie again in the doorway. She was rubbing her eyes unhappily. "Daddy!" "Go to bed, Susie," Delfield said firmly. He could see that Malcolm was staring at the little girl in annoyance. Jean popped up again. "Into bed, young lady," she said sternly. "Don't want to go to bed." Jean took her arm and pulled Susie into the bedroom. "Now listen, young lady. Do you want a spanking, or are you going to bed?" "Wee-wee," said Susie. "Have to make a wee-wee." Her mother stood for a moment in uncertainty. They had only in the past 2 months completed the child's toilet training. "All right," Jean relented. She picked up Susie and carried her to the bathroom. "The second consideration," said Malcolm, "is your own ability, Mr. Delfield. Your own administrative ability. Your ability to handle an operation of this size and complexity. You are a good prospector, there's no doubt of that. You've proved up your claim in a very short time, and your samples show a fine sense of discrimination. However, I must say candidly, there are hundreds of good prospectors in the asteroid belt, men just as capable as you are, if not always as lucky. The men we're looking for are not merely prospectors. They're highly competent administrators. They're able to handle other men. They're able to keep those men working hard. They're able to drive them and discipline them and produce results. Are you that kind of a man, Mr. Delfield? Can you do the job?" "I think so," said Delfield confidently, "but you'll have to be the judge of that. You see, on Earth—" "Pink puppy dog! I want pink puppy dog!" Susie wept in the doorway. Delfield felt a flush of embarrassment. What a night for Susie to be difficult! He looked at Jean imploringly. His wife glanced down with a helpless expression. "Excuse me," said Delfield to the man from Mars Metals. He got up and went into Susie's bedroom. Susie, you'll have to get into bed, and no more nonsense.
Pink puppy dog.
Delfield picked up the little girl and put her in bed. Now you stay there and be quiet, or you'll get a spanking. She was silent as he turned to leave. Then she clambered out of bed.
Daddy, give me pink puppy dog.
Delfield lost his patience. He knew Malcolm was watching and listening, especially after that speech about disciplining other men. He'd never really spanked Susie before, but he did so now. She cried terribly, inconsolably, in her bed. It was impossible to carry on a conversation in the living room with her wails and the persistent humming of the compressor in the background. This was such an important interview, such a turning point in his career, to be marred by an unruly child. Jean glared at him disapprovingly as Delfield flicked the switch. The door to Susie's room slid firmly shut, muffling her cries almost completely. After a while they died out, and the air compressor stopped also, but it was hard for Delfield to pick up the thread of conversation. What had he been about to say about himself on Earth? The two discussed other peripheral points, yet Delfield knew the damage was done. He had a sinking, heart-sick feeling when Malcolm closed his briefcase a half-hour later. "Well," said the man from Mars Metals, standing up, "this has been a very pleasant chat. Quite instructive and exploratory on both sides." He started to put on his spacesuit. "I'll report the substance of our discussion to the regional office on Ceres. I'm sure you'll be hearing from us very shortly." They watched his private rocket take off, and then Jean said anxiously, "What do you think?" "I'm sure they will say no," said Delfield wearily. "Had it been yes, Malcolm would have signed me up tonight." Jean caught her breath, suddenly remembering. "Oh, poor Susie! Why did you shut the door on her like that?" "Why did she behave like that?" Delfield said angrily. Jean ran to the door switch. The door mechanism whined, but the hatch itself remained tightly in place. "It must be jammed," said the father. He pounded on the metal panel. "Now try it." Jean flicked the switch back and forth several times. The door did not move. Then Delfield saw the red warning light on the jamb above the door. "The safety!" he screamed. "It won't work because of the safety!" He got into his spacesuit swiftly, with trembling hands and sobbing breath. A moment later he was outside the hermetic shack in the deep space vacuum of asteroid K-840. He was staring into Susie's room by the light of an electric torch. His child lay in bed, asleep, brown ringlets framing her face, the fine tracery of veins faintly visible on her forehead. She was a beautiful little girl, and the sleep had come gradually, tenderly. The air had leaked out slowly through the small crack at the base of the hemisphere where the rock had faulted. All day the compressor had replaced the loss, until Delfield closed the door, the airtight door. In one claw of his spacesuit the father held an emergency blowout patch. It was hard for him to put it on the breech. Half through the hole, where it had been sucked by escaping air early in the morning, was Susie's pink puppy dog. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. Ad astra, ad nauseam.